in the beginning and support both verbally and with a rather substantial consignment of inventory to help me get started. And I owe a lot to him, and my pleading with him a few months ago to give me a clinic when he would not give one to anybody made me feel even better when I finally got one. And I asked him to just come up and tell stories about today and yesterday, and he thought he'd like to show you some slides that he had of John Allen's Gorre Daphetid, and I said that's even better. If you have any questions for him during the show or after the show or whatever, just please board him out, and he'll talk until he gets tired and says he's had enough. So, I would like to present Mr. Jim Finlake.
Thank you, John. Is there anyone here who can't hear me comfortably? To establish credentials for dealing with John Allen's Gorre Daphetid Railroad, I first met John in the early 50s and went to visit his railroad, and it was one of the first railroads that I had visited after I got into the hobby, and for some peculiar notion I got the idea that all railroads are that way, all model railroads are of that stature and that quality, and that didn't prove to be the case, and it has messed up my own attitudes for quite some spell. But fortunately, John and I got along well enough so that we could work together, and the vast majority of my knowledge and experience in model railroading initially came from working with him and from listening to him. So I made up my mind to show you some slides of the Gorre Daphetid rather than look at me. It's a lot better to look at a well-executed model railroad. And by the consensus of present-day opinion, John is one of the finest in the world, if not the finest. It won't be duplicated. A number of people, Bill McClanahan, myself, and several other people who are old-timers in the hobby, had been around for a spell, came to the conclusion that there won't be another railroad of that size and that quality probably ever again. John combined several factors that are necessary to putting together a railroad like that are growing less and less available to the general public. He had the space. He bought a house and excavated underneath it, built his own basement, and he could build it to the exact configuration and leave the floor of it where he wanted it to give him the contours of terrain that he needed for his railroad. Second, John studied art in college for 4 years, and he had artistic skills that the vast majority of us simply don't have. We can't do the things that he can do. I can't paint a picture, and I know that. He had the ability to, and the artistic skill to inject that into his model railroading. The third and most important thing was he had the time. John was not burdened with having to make a living for himself. He had sufficient funds to defray his expenses for the rest of his life. As a consequence of the railroad he built, he spent probably an average of 8 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week for 20-some years building. And it was as good as you could ever hope for a railroad to be. Most of the people are acquainted with the railroad through articles in Model Railroader and Craftsman magazines, and they think probably the railroad is beautifully scenic without ever really knowing that it ran like a Rolex watch. He was as good mechanically as he was artistically, and it reflected in the fact that he had a railroad that ran well, ran reliably, and kept right on running until the day he died. To give you an idea, to tell you a few of the odd little facts about the railroad itself, having been around the railroad, and I was around it off and on for a period of quite a few years, and it had always progressed, and you never saw all of the Gorre Daphetid. I came in there one time. I came in from the Orient, and John was gracious enough to have me as a house guest when I was in California, there in Monterey. And I looked at the mountain, and there were 3 little goats way up on the mountain. I said, "John, when'd you put those goats in?" And he said, "When I built the mountain 7 years ago." you just never saw the railroad. You're always seeing details that you didn't realize were there. You just kind of took them for granted. You had to look close to see all of the fine, fine, fine little details that were included in the railroad itself. This picture is the main line leaving the main yard at Gorre. The main line you went into the tunnel to get onto the main line. It ducked underneath the yard and came out in open country sort of territory. It was a nice way to transit from a cityscape with a trolley over here onto the open country. The train didn't move very far, 6 feet, and suddenly you were out in the open, wide open country. John only had one double slip switch on the railroad, and it was not on the main line, because at the time he put that switch in, there were no store-bought double slip switches. There were very few store-bought turnouts, and he was never sure it was going to work. He didn't dare tie up the main line, so he put it off to the side of the main line. And it worked beautifully. He said, oh, I wish I'd put it over there then, but changing it back over there would be another major undertaking. This, in the immediate foreground here, is the only double slip switch on the Gorre Daphetid. And he did it, as he said in many instances, he did it to prove that he could do it. Once having done it, he wasn't about to do it again. It was sort of like he did with cars. He would finally detail one and win a contest with it and prove that he could do it. But when you have a railroad that large, you simply cannot go to that much time expenditure, that much time for every car on your railroad. The Gorre Daphetid had 280 cars. This is a round figure, plus or minus. And if it takes you a month to build a really finely detailed car that is a contest winner, 280 months is a lot of time to put in on cars. That's over 10 years. And there are a lot of other things on a railroad that need being done and take time. Do any of you have any questions that I might answer in regard to this particular photograph? Okay, this was at the track-wise, this was the far end of the railroad. It's fairly close to the main yard. It was about 15 feet from the main yard, but you had covered an awful lot of track. The Gorre Daphetid had over 1,000 feet of track, probably 1,200 feet of track in total. That's counting the branch line and all of the sidings and so forth, the yard area. This was up at the opposite end, up at, named after his brother. And I'll think of it in a minute. Andrews, his brother's name was Andrew, and he called the far end of the railroad where it looped back Andrews for him. Well, he used family names quite frequently on his railroad. The center structure there is a detritus. He called it detritus. Actually, it's sand, gravel, rock, junk materials that you use in construction work. It was built from a three-part article in Model Railroader back in the late 40s, and it won a Best of Show at a Pacific Coast Region convention at one time, fully lighted and fully detailed on the interior, up to including the pin-up calendars on the walls in the office and the broom in the corner and all of the rest of the details. It was lighted. You can't see it, but underneath it there is a place for trucks to go down there so they could gravity feed the materials into whatever local conveyance was taken to where they would be used. And even that was lighted underneath. There were lights underneath there. Up in this particular area, Andrews only had 3 tracks. They were sort of like a 3-track yard, except they were spread out and had scenery between them. And they each of them had about 5 destinations on that track. For example, if I can get up here and point a little bit, you would deliver, well, the sort of cars at a detritus factory. This is where you unloaded and they went up. Incidentally, this is an endless belt, and it worked. It ran. Anytime you threw the switch at the end that you were going back in there with a train, the lights came on and the little endless belt started going around. And well, there were lights underneath this adjunct to the building also. But as I said, there were he'd have several destinations. This next one obviously is a oil loading or oil unloading facility. Behind that is a junkyard. There was another junkyard. There was a junkyard eventually put in. It didn't show in this photograph. It wasn't there at the time. But you were liable to have 5 destinations on one track, and you better have your cars lined up right. If you got one behind it that had to be delivered to another track, you were kind of out of luck because there was only one little tiny runaround up there to sort things out with. Do any of you have any questions? Anytime you have questions, just to holler the questions out. I'll be more than glad to oblige you. Oh, I might add that this was real water. He had to pour I think he had about a two or 2.5 gallon pail there, and he would go fill it in his dark room in the one other part of the basement, go and pour it in here, and 20 minutes later that water would go over this wheel and turn this water wheel, work its way down and go out through a sewer in the basement floor that was camouflaged with scenery. You never knew where it went, but it was real water. That was a mistake. It carried dust, and the dust got, when there was no water in it, it didn't look realistic, nearly as realistic as it should have. It only really looked right when there was water in it. This is up on his branch line, and it was, he kept antiquated equipment up there in the sense that the engines and the cars that went up on that branch line were of an era earlier than the railroad itself. The railroad was the last days of steam, actually, in the early 50s, between World War II, the end of World War II, and the mid-50s when diesels started taking over. He never ran diesels on his railroad. Well, he had friends who would operate. He would bring diesels up there and check to make sure that they would perform adequately, but he had none himself. He didn't use them. I don't know, his objection to diesels was, I suppose, when you get older, you get old-fashioned. You don't take to the new things all that well, all that readily. And he always, no, another friend of ours referred to diesel as a sheepdog. Unless you know which way to look, you don't know which way it's going. And it's of little interest to anything other than the sheepdog anyway. This building simulated a burned-out building. He built it stick by stick, burnt stick by burnt stick. And it had a red light in the bottom, and I guess he changed that, but that used to be red. And it looked like it. And one time a picture appeared, he'd put a mirror up against it, and it looked like a double. He looked like a long building that was only burnt out in the center, but actually it was just a duplication of the half building that he built. This building was fairly well known. It was in Model Railroad. It was on the cover. It's a Spreckles station, a brick station. It was there in California. Actually served a sugar plantation, a Spreckles Sugar works there. And it later, I think they put it into a book later too. It's a nice little brick station, and the thing is, the station itself is extremely small. The full 3-view plans of it cover less than half a page on Model Railroader magazine. But you can go to a lot of detail to make it look right. If you got the right scales, the trick to model railroading is, in my opinion, 50% of it is whole scale, especially if you're going to take a picture. If you're going to take a picture of something that's out of scale, looks right to you, won't look right at all in that photograph. You'll notice that it looks big. If a guy's carrying a lantern as big as a butter churn, you can notice it quickly in a photograph. You can't notice it all that quickly when you're looking at a railroad, because your eyes say, well, I've been looking at the lanterns all my life, and that's what they look like. That may be what they look like, but they aren't that size at all either. So try to hold scale. It will very, very effectively improve the appearance of your railroad. You get used to it after a while, holding scale, and it comes automatically to you to the point where you look at something and you know it's out of scale. In the early days when N-scale first started coming out, it was the greatest thing that had happened to HO scale, because many of their things were right for HO. They were twice as big as they should have been for N-scale. That includes brick paper. It includes many, many things that we don't realize how big they are. You will realize if you ever take a picture and look at them. Pictures show you, if you want to improve your handiwork, take pictures of it. That will show you what it really looks like, not what your eyes tell you it looks like. Buildings, in my opinion, are one of the more important things that you do on a railroad, because your visitors may not know very much about how trains ran or what a steam locomotive looked like. A great many of them never saw one. But they know what buildings look like. They see them every day. So be careful with your buildings. I'm sensitive on that point. I like buildings. Oh, this is the same building, but look at this end. Incidentally, in this, where he had to pour the water in, that couldn't have been more than 2 inches deep when the water, when it was, had to pull 2.5 gallons in there, or whatever he poured in. He had an alligator in there. Boy, it was a big alligator, as big as a dinosaur. And most people never saw it. You just didn't see all the detail on that railroad. There's no way of seeing it under any circumstances. You come and people who were there for hours never really saw the railroad. I was in that railroad room probably hundreds or maybe even over 1,000 hours, and just no way of seeing everything that was on the railroad. This is an example of his use of mirrors. That is a mirror. You look at you can see the other end of this building in that mirror. I'm surprised he took that picture. Of course, when it was, if it had been published and brought down to size in a magazine, you'd never been able to tell what that was. You can see it projected on a screen. That is the other end of this building. There was another mirror on this wall, and it reflected in the opposite direction. He was a real genius with mirrors. He was a Merlin. He could fool the devil out of you. Time and again I got fooled. One evening he asked me, he says, how many mirrors are there on the railroad? And at that time I'd been around the railroad quite a bit, and I think I could count 13 that I was absolutely sure was a mirror that was intended to and very effectively did enlarge the railroad or deceive people who were looking at the railroad. And he told me that there were 27. And he may have been exaggerating. He was not averse to doing that, but I knew there were a lot of mirrors on that railroad. And they were where you least expect them to be. Well, they were where you didn't expect them to be, or you would recognize that it was a mirror quickly. This little building is a space compression plant. He always lamented, as all model railroaders do, the fact that we never have enough space to do all the things that we wanted. So he built a little space compression factory. You could look in, there was an eyepiece that you could look through, and a bunch of little people down in there working. They were all moving around, little wheels and machines that really looked like machines. And they were allegedly compressing space so you'd have room to do all the things you wanted to if you bought a barrel of their space and brought it back to full size. This is an example of what John called three-dimensional flats. They have 3 dimensions, but they're not nearly the depth that a grain elevator might have been. This was unfinished. Eventually he put a walkway across the top of those, and it was all, and this actually is just as flat as that blue sky is back there. It was on the blue sky, but it was done with such artistic skill that, boy, it really would, especially deceptive if he took a picture of it exactly the right way, and he knew how to take the pictures. He was a professional photographer, among other things. Well, this was down at Port, and here again, these are 3-dimensional flats. This building came out and was just an L shape for the 2 of the walls. Was all he had room to put in there. Back behind the building there was another little mirror, but you didn't know that was a mirror. It looked like a whole other town on past that building. It wasn't. He was marvelous at doing that. At one time, John intended to put real water down here at Port, and there was a great big tidal basin in there too. And he built the benchwork with the idea that he was going to put real water in there. And at one time he commented to me, he said, you know, A 6-inch minute would be a 42-foot whale if you put it in there to, you know, pick up bugs that got on top of the water. And then it dawned on him after, 3 or 4 years, what the humidity from that water would do to his track work as far as causing electrical problems in his track work was concerned. And he ultimately lowered the level and duplicated that with plaster and brush, and by putting spar varnish on top of that. And boy, it looked like real water anyway, but it looked like it was solid, frozen solid in one place. There were waves and so forth, all those things in there. This is the main line. At one time, he only intended it to be a single track, but Port got to be the busiest place on his railroad, and he had to double track it through there. And boy, just so much stuff. That was the busiest place on the railroad. It was a center point of the railroad, and anybody that ran that had his hands full. Believe me, there were only 2 or 3 people that I know of who became really proficient at running Port. He eventually had 2 boards so 2 people could run Port, and they still couldn't keep up with it. Just too many trains coming through there with too many jobs to do. Well, this is the first picture. You can see the train leaving town. This is the this is the track work looking in the opposite direction. This little drugstore here, I've forgotten what he called it. It was for one of his family members. A lot of the buildings were named after friends, operators in his crew. And it took, at the end, it took 8 people to run the railroad. You just couldn't run it with less than that. Well, you could run it with less than that, but not at its full capacity, all the fun you could have with it. And I operated on it on many occasions. He never considered, he says, you're a half an operator. I wasn't there often enough to really become quite skilled in any one position. And John was a stickler for operations, much more so than suited my fancy. He didn't like, when you were operating, he didn't like for you to talk. He didn't like you to do anything but operate that railroad. And he considered his operators as friends, but when they were in there operating the railroad, they weren't friends. They were tools to make that railroad run. And if a tool didn't do right, he threw it away, so to speak. He let you know in a hurry. His entire railroad was hand-laid track. Every bit of it, I say, not every bit of it. When he got into a long tunnel or a long area of hidden track, it bothered him not one bit to put down prefab track, code 100 rail, although he used code 70 and a lot of code 55. But back in there, you never saw it, and it didn't bother him a bit. His conscience didn't hurt him to go ahead and put the prefab track down, make sure that it would run real well, and forget about it. All hidden track in tunnels and track behind scenery, when you could not see the train, you could not hear it either, because he laid prefab track. For example, he would put a 1/4-inch square of balsa across every few inches. It would really deaden the sound, and it worked. It really worked. When a train went into a tunnel, it was dramatic. Boy, the sound stopped. And he had sound in his locomotives long before PFM or anyone else came out with electronic sound. He did it mechanically. He had a little packet of BBs, I guess they were, out of a shotgun shell, and he geared that so that every revolution of the drivers, it ticked that 4 times, and it was surprisingly loud, and you could hear it. But that was long before they ever had electronic sound such as we have. And it, of course, went at the right speed for the locomotive. The faster the locomotive went, the faster it chuffed. And it whistles. They didn't have electronic whistles, and what he had was an old Lionel's whistle, but they had to have it. It had to be in one spot. You couldn't put it in the locomotive; it's far too big. And you pushed a button when the locomotive was there, and you didn't dare push it any other time, or it didn't sound right. If you pushed it any other time, he let you know that too. This is the trolley line over here, and it ran when he turned it on, when he had visitors there, and he turned it on. The trolley just went around in a kind of a dog bone. It wasn't a folded dog bone. It was a dog bone around through city streets and through buildings and so forth. The thing was, he had it electrically wired so that there was a slowly rotating disc down there, and you never knew where that streetcar was going to stop. It would always stop at a corner, a place where obviously a streetcar normally would stop to discharge or take on passengers, but you never knew when that was going to be dead for the second when the trolley got there. And it may sit there, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, or even longer, and all at once it'd pick up and go the rest of the way. But he himself had no way of knowing whether it was going to stop at this corner or that corner, or whether it was going to miss 5 corners altogether or what. It was just random. In order to get I remember this bicycle because it was deceptive. Back in the days before he had to make the frame himself out of tiny pieces. They had no commercially available bicycles, and if you just, he was careful how he lighted it and careful where he put it, far enough back so that it wasn't obvious. But those wheels are simply discs of celluloid, and the spokes were painted on there with a ruling pan with paint, and the tire was the same way. But it would fool you. You'd swear that was a 3-dimensional bicycle. It wasn't. One of the other deceptive things he did, and that used to bother me. It bothered me only because he moved things around on the layout. I'd see a figure. He had some that were sort of trademarks of his railroad. One man with a peg leg, for example, and he would move them from one place to another. And I think that must be a commercially available figure because I didn't see it here the last time, and he's got 2 of them evidently. But I can never remember where I saw it the last time, so I never knew that he would actually move figures around for that very purpose. And again, it worked. This is down at the lowest point on the railroad, physically, and the bottom of the basement. Over here, the floor of the basement was only 18 inches below the track here. If you stood there, you were looking down on the trains. And this one was pretty, well, no, it wasn't close to the high point. It was getting up there pretty high, but there was another track that was even higher than that, went across there. We'll come to a slide that includes that pretty soon. This was down at Squaw Bottom. John posed pictures. He never took pictures of the trains as they would have been in an operation, simply because you can't make photographs look real and under those circumstances. He would pose pictures and do it on purpose. He'd hold as close as he could to a particular, some things he said, I will not do. You can't have a locomotive. This locomotive would never have been faced the other way, simply because ordinarily that was a spur. It was dead end back there. And ordinarily you would back in there and shift cars from the train on the siding, put in the cars that you wanted from this end. Although he had no compunction about running locomotives backwards, believe me. We intended to, this was this station was a combined effort. John did the design, he sketched it. He did that quite frequently, because he was an artist. He'd give me a sketch, say, build me this building. I said, give me some dimensions. Well, I don't want it any bigger than this and no bigger than that and so forth. And this was a joint effort. He had used a circular piece of plastic, clear plastic, out of a tube to get his windows here. And then all he did was just make a overlay of scribe siding that went around that top and bottom. You notice all he wanted to do was put a light in there and have it come out. But he did a lot of things on the building. He would work on it a while, and I would work on it a while, and I'd get tired of it and give it back to him, and he'd get tired of it and give it back to me. I'd come something I couldn't do. I'd say, can you do this? Of course I can. And most of the time he could. He was really good with some things. He put lights in this locomotive here. It's an 260. That had a light in it long before you ever heard of lights being in locomotives, and that was in there. The light, he had to use a regular flashlight bulb, and it was way down here. All he did was take a rod of lucite and transmit the light up to that headlight, then smooth it off and polish the lens in front. And it was deceptive. You would have sworn there was a bulb in that little headlight. But that was Zamac boiler. And if you've ever worked Zamac, it isn't that easy to work, believe me. You can't drill it that well. You can, but you buy an awful lot of bits.
Jim, tell us about the chimney in the back.
Oh yeah, you can't see the chimney. It was on the back side apparently. There was a chimney that went through both of these eaves, and it was a brick chimney. When I was working on it, he said, put a chimney on there, and I put the chimney on there, and I knew John well enough that he was not going to be satisfied with my work, and I don't blame him. He was scarcely satisfied with his own as good as it was. But I've made the chimney so it would slide up and down. In other words, you could make it as high as you wanted to or as low as you wanted to. And after I finished and we had it over on the layout there, he looked at it and he says, the chimney needs to be a little shorter. I said, all right. And I carried the station back over to my workbench. We had 2 workbenches in his basement there. He faced one wall, I faced another wall at right angles. And all I did was pull it up, pull the chimney up. You could pull it up quite a ways. And he came over and I said, is that about right? He said, yeah, it looks all right, that looks all right. No, I pushed it down. He wanted it shorter first. And he came over and looked at it, and he said, yeah, that's fine. And then every time I'd think of it when I was down there, I'd go over and pull it up another 1/4 of an inch, up another 1/4 of an inch. And it took him an awful long time to notice it. And he finally looked and he says, I don't remember that damn chimney being that tall. What the hell happened? I said, oh, you said it was all right. And he says, no. You're going to have to cut off some more. It's too long. So I go back over and push the chimney back. I wasn't cutting off anything. I just moved it back out of the building. And he come over and said, that's about right. That's fine. And we went through that at least 3 times. And he never caught on to the fact that that chimney was movable. Down. He would have been furious had he known that he had been euchred into something, believing something, because he was very observant. He was supposed to notice things like that. This is I said the main line came out of the yard. That's on the upper track. This is an area here that eventually became a logging operation with all sorts of wires and trees, and just completely detailed. As I said, you had to stand there for 20 minutes looking at all the details in that area. This eventually became a place to lift out logs and load them on the cars. There was derricks and all sorts of things in it. This tree is interesting, how he made that. This was back before they had ground foam or had any of the niceties that you and I really appreciate having nowadays. That tree was, one time he and I were down in the desert, and he knew of a particular type of shrub down there that had real fine branches on it. And we looked and finally found some and brought back enough to make jillions of trees. Carried a carload of it back, but he was very generous. He would give it to friends after he told them how he made this tree. The leaves, all the individual leaves on this, we had a guy in the operating crew there, and he worked in a bank, and they used to punch out paid on a check and put it in your file. They probably do it a completely different way now, electronically, if no other way. Those are the tiny little holes that punched out that said paid, or whatever they put on it. They all had, they didn't let those fall on the floor. The bank had a little box of them. This guy'd bring us a little box of them, and John would simply spray that with adhesive and dip it in there, and it'd catch up all the leaves. And the nice part was, all checks are not the same color, even weren't in those days. And you got a nice variety in there from the various checks. Oh, I guess they don't use them anymore. And that was the difficulty. People would ask John how he did things, and he would have done it 10 years before, and it simply wasn't, just like these check punches. They're not available nowadays. There's no way you could do that. You might find some place that punches out something in paper, but you'd have to find that in order to duplicate that particular system. This is just about the highest point on the railroad. John was so proficient and so skilled at scenery that he would never let me do scenery on that railroad. He considered me a real sawbones when it came to scenery. But the only scenery I ever did, and it doesn't show on here, was when he designed this bridge and this arch across here. To make it look exactly right, he had to go up part of the way on the abutment of this stone bridge behind it. And he always intended to put the scenery around that so that it just didn't butt into that bridge. And he allowed me to do that. It was the only scenery I ever did on his railroad. The only thing that wasn't very hard, I think he went back and redid it because it looked a lot better after I looked at it a few times later. It got to looking better. This is all northeastern shapes, every bit of it here. And boy, he built the whole bridge over on his bench. And then brought it over and it went in just beautifully. But the first time he took an engine out on that, it was a long way down to that basement floor from there. And he did it gingerly, believe me. Took it out very, very slowly. That's that 260 I was telling you about, was an old Zamac boiler. He never had the same tender behind a locomotive that came with that locomotive. And it really changes the appearance of a locomotive to change the tender behind it. They were all interchangeable, and he'd swap off a couple of tenders every once in a while. One from a 280 and one from a 260. He may swap the tenders. And you'd swear it was a different locomotive. It really changed. I'm easily fooled, I guess. Well, he fooled me on that many times. And you can't appreciate the fact that this is a corner wall in the basement here. This goes back in this direction. This goes back in that direction. But not only was he able to do it artistically, he was also a crackerjack photographer, and if it didn't look right, he knew how to make it look right with that camera. And I could not tell you where this is on the railroad, but that engine I'm familiar with, that's narrow gauge because this is dual gauge, and that was a narrow gauge locomotive, scratch built. John had dual gauge. He had narrow gauge on the railroad, but that was a complete separate railroad. He had so much of it on there, and it never really operated in conjunction with he could make trains run on it, but he never fitted it into the mainline operations, because by that time there was so damn much mainline operation, you couldn't get any more squeezed in. There wasn't time enough to run all the trains that he wanted to run. But he did this plasterwork back in the days before no one was doing things. A tunnel was when you cut a hole in both ends of a shoebox and put it over the track, and that was a tunnel. That was the way most of us railroaded. He opened up model railroading as no one ever has, and no one ever will, because it is done much more slowly now and by a number of people rather than one individual doing the pioneering work as he did. Not uncommon. These little scenes, this was scratch built, and he purposely left this out. You could see ties down in there. The trick to that was keeping the people out of the way, because that damn trolley went through there and it had to go through there. I went to visit a railroad once up in Kansas City. I'll never forget it. And the guy had seen this, either this photograph or a black and white, probably black and white in the early days, of this particular scene, and duplicated it on his layout. And I looked, and he had several figures that you knew a locomotive couldn't get through there without hitting those figures. And finally I asked one of his friends, I didn't want to ask him, I didn't want to embarrass him. I asked him, I said, I don't see how in the heck he can run trains through there. Oh, he don't run trains. He just builds scenery. Doesn't run. Static railroad. Story of my life. This is again up at Andrews with the detritus factory here. This is an old Atlas station that he put up on another station, made it look like a two-story station. He used a freight house underneath it. And this was not yet, this was the runaround we were building, and you can see that this is the frog and points of the turnout that hadn't been put in yet. I'm surprised. Well, he wanted to make a record of the area as he went along, and he probably intended to duplicate that photograph later. But you can see the track is not finished there. His track work was superb, just unbelievably good. It did me an awful lot of good, and that is, if I'm laying track that is on a curve or laying track that's in a turnout, your eyes deceive you. You say that, well, that maintains the same radius all the way around. It doesn't. If it doesn't, your eyes can't pick it up. But he taught me when I was laying track. I would put a mirror on a coffee can with a clothespin, and I looked in the mirror and laid the track, because that mirror is the same as looking at a photograph, and if it deviates from the radius you're intending to follow, it's instantly noticeable, and you can look right straight at it with your eyes and never pick it up. You can see it in that mirror. Now, it takes a lot of practice because you do everything in reverse with your hands. The mirror tells you move to the right, and you move to the left to make your hand move to the right in the mirror. But once you get used to it, it goes fairly quickly. And even if you lay it any other way, it's a good thing to check it with that mirror. Look at it in the mirror. You can tell whether it's straight. If you're getting derailments in a turnout, if there's an irregularity in some place where things are mismatched for some reason or another, look at it and put a mirror down there and look in the mirror, and it will jump right at you what's wrong with it, where it's out of line. I like that. This is the main yard that ended at a mirror also. That's an old Alexander coaling station somebody was going to throw away, and John could never stand to see anything thrown away. He saved everything. He was that kind. He was a rat holder. He just put a different top on it. It looked completely different after he finished doing a few things to it, and it didn't take him one evening to make it a really nicely done water tank, whereas it had ordinarily just been an old Alexander water tank, nothing special about it at all. Coupled with the fact that he knew how to weather the thing. He did his weathering and some of his coloration of scenery and so forth with dry powders, and he got real good at it. Well, he started off real good, and then he got better is what happened. Night scene. And this is with real lights. He had some areas that he used black light because he just didn't want to spend that much money for all those bulbs that had taken to light the buildings. So he'd paint them with fluorescent paint, hide a black light up behind the backdrop, and it was deceptive. It fooled you. You thought it was real lights in there. They weren't. He only had a 5-stall roundhouse, and for years it sat unfinished because this was out of battleship linoleum. He carved all of the rock work into the sides and ends of the building, and then he got tired of it, and he didn't want to put the windows in. He euchred me into putting the windows in one time, and I never want another job like that. The walls were already there. You had to make the windows fit, and if they didn't fit, they had to be light sealed at those windows so you didn't get light leaks around the edges. I didn't want to do that again, and if I'd known what I was getting into, I'd absolutely refused to do that. More work than I like to do. Anything's more work than I like to do. This particular building here is Witt's Tower, and it didn't look like it. I'm sorry I don't have a better slide of it. That picture was actually made out of dozens upon dozens of little castings of a 3-window area here with the corner. And you could put them up to each other and make a building as long as you wanted, or you can make it as high as you wanted. And if you wanted a door there, you simply cut through the plaster casting down here and put it out to the street, whatever you wanted. It was a marvelous piece of work, and it was beautifully done because he only had to make one of them for any number of buildings or any number of castings, and he went to a lot of trouble, and it was well done. I can't blame you for what I'm doing. That's the station down at where I better check from this. Oh, that's got to be the trolley back here. So this is down at Gorre, the station at Gorre, and all this is just a piece of card. And he would take a construction paper and cut out all kind of odd shapes and just put them on there one after another. I've seen him do it. Boy, he could do it so fast. He put in one after another, and you wonder how he knew what color of that construction paper to put in there. But when it finished, it looked real nice. But I never saw him do things twice. Almost never. If he did them twice, and I'm sure that he must have, he didn't let you know that he had to do them twice.
How did he control dust on his?
You don't control dust. What you do is keep it at a minimum. You couldn't keep it out of the railroad room. We had 2 vacuum cleaners, and what we would do is it took 2 people to vacuum the top of the layout, one of them blowing and the other one sucking, so that you stirred it up a little bit and then caught it with this other one. You had to be careful because every once in a while a tree or a people or almost anything would go into the one that was receiving. If I was handling the one that was receiving and it picked up a figure, that was my fault. Even if he blew it in there, it was my fault. I remember that. Oh, this is down in the port area itself. This is the car ferry Annabelle, named after a favorite niece of his. And Annabelle was a fine little girl, but she didn't care all that much about railroad, and she thought John was crazy. Much like many of our wives feel about us. But this had 2 tracks on it, and the operation rules for that thing were enough to drive you up the wall. You were never supposed to have more than 1 car more on one side than the other, on the supposition that this would cause the ferry to capsize. And when you were in a hurry down there trying to get cars onto that ferry or get them off of that ferry, and it was only there for a short period, and it was posted right at the end of where the gate came down to keep anything going out there when the ferry wasn't there. It said when it arrived and when it departed. And there was a master clock in the railroad room, and you looked at the time and knew when that ferry was going to leave. Now, it had never actually physically left this area, but the gate come down, and you couldn't do any more work there. So you get in a hurry. You didn't care whether there's 5 cars on one side and 1 on the other or what. This is a beautiful big bridge up over the, it's sort of a basin in here, actually. And even to the details, this is a 48 star flag. As the states were added, he would change the flag to match the particular era that he was modeling. It wasn't 50 states back in the last days of steam, so it had 48 stars on it. Little things like that he was picky about. And most people didn't sit there and count the stars, believe me. Oh, this is some of the plaster covered with spar varnish that he used for water eventually down there in the port area. This is the main station, Great Divide. John always felt that he misnamed the railroad. He named it the way we name a lot of our railroads and the way we do a lot of things. When we were early in the hobby, we pick a railroad name that sounds cute to us, but the cuteness gets old after you've been at it a few years. And he particularly wished he had named his railroad Great Divide, which would have been GD, and he could have left a lot of lettering on cars and one thing or another. But by the time he was persuaded that Gorre Daphetid, spelled the way he spelled it, was not a good idea, it was too late. The railroad was so well known by that name, and he had so many cars that were full lettered with that name that it would have been a major undertaking. This was only half of a catwalk. That's a mirror back here. And he had painted on the mirror some of the smoke. But this is only half. It looked like a hole. When you looked at it, you could see the other half in the mirror. And it was, as I said, quite deceptive, believe me. But he would do that, and he was very careful to, sometimes you'd have a figure that appeared in a mirror. You could see it in front, but he would paint the back of the figure with different color suit. And you thought that was another person walking the other way. As I said, he went into such intense detail that that's what made his railroad great, in my opinion. Oh, this is that roundhouse. That was carved battleship and linoleum, very heavy stuff. I picked those sides up and worked with them. Boy, they were heavy. I didn't like it. Oh, 2 sections of main line, one going to port and one coming back out of port. Ultimately, there was a locomotive, and you probably, I don't think you can see it. There was a locomotive over here, and John went to the trouble of, it was a locomotive, one of the very first brass locomotives that came out of Japan, that to us was astounding how beautifully done it was. But it didn't run for sour apples, and if it didn't run, he didn't want it. But he loved the fact that he had that brass locomotive with all the detail on it. And eventually, what we did was, he was good at carving figures, HO figures. He was really good at that. He carved a figure of a man with an acetylene torch in his hand. And we ran wires so that you couldn't see him. And this guy was up on the boiler, and we fed one wire in and then grounded the boiler. And boy, you could see that little blue flame come out of that acetylene torch, as pretty as you please. The only difficulty with that was you couldn't run it constantly, and people wouldn't notice it. It was too tiny for you to notice. You had to be looking real close. You couldn't leave it on very long because it made a little hole in the boiler where the electrical spark jumped across there. Same thing happens to your wheels when you lose contact on your railroad. They get pitted too. Well, it was my favorite locomotive on the whole railroad. It was a B&O 280. It started a life as a B&O 280, one of the brass imports. He had an arrangement with PFM that he furnished them with some photographs for their advertising, in return for which they would furnish him with some brass locomotives. And he knew what to do with them, but that was a great locomotive. Unbelievably powerful for a 280, because he poured the boiler with lead. Oh, here's the car ferry Annabelle. You can see the arrival time and the time it leaves. There was a master clock, and you went by that master clock when you were operating. And at 12 o'clock, this gate bar came down, and you could no longer put cars in or take them off of there. You had to be finished switching that ferry. You get it out between 12 and 5. That was 12 noon or 5 in the afternoon, or 12 midnight and 5 in the morning. More of that bridge, it was so marvelously well done. It was a 2-track bridge, and a Pratt truss bridge. It just, I don't know whether there's another photograph in here. These are not anywhere near all the photographs I have of the Gorre Daphetid. These are just a representative sampling of them. Jack Lemming here lived in Dallas and still does, and has his own railroad that was named after him. That appeared in an article in Model Railroader. When the railroad burned, the building went with it. And incidentally, that's only, you can see where the building's cut off right back here at this one little spot. There just wasn't room enough for it to go all the way back. But it was lighted inside and did the job. And that was the original building. It was here in Dallas. We went to visit a friend here, came here to visit a friend, and he was so taken with that railroad, we took a bunch of pictures, or with that structure, we took a bunch of pictures, and that's severely condensed. Actually, it was quite a big facility, and built the building, and then an article appeared in the magazine. It's Andrews, a station, an old Atlas station with just dummied in stuff down at the bottom. Lynn's Archives. Lynn Westcott was the editor of Model Railroader at the time. Lynn used to come out and visit John, and we were all pretty closely acquainted. And we kidded Lynn because you could send Lynn an article, and it may be 5 years before it ever gets into the magazine. And we said he must have archives just full of articles that are never going to be published or haven't been published yet. John used to complain about it. I didn't complain about it. They were the wheels. I was just a little spoke. I didn't have much to say about that. Oh, this is that logging area I told you that eventually went in long after some of the detailing was done on it. Boy, it was that was a hard area to switch too, because you were way down at the control panel here, and you had to know that railroad well to know where those uncoupling ramps were. They were mechanical. They were not electromagnetic. They were mechanical, but because he used Baker couplers. Man, hitting that thing exactly right was a real chore. Your depth perception was off, you might as well give up. Well, this was one of my favorite areas on the rail. Oh, this became a whole town. That thing disappeared, and a whole bunch of stuff went in there later, as I recall. This is Frenchman's Gulch. There were 4 levels of track. There's one on up above that. But they were so well done, and so there's only about 2 feet between the forward part of the scenery here and the very backdrop at the back. But it was so well done, it looked like you really felt as if it was deep in there. Fool the devil out of you. This was the longest single unit bridge on the whole railroad. And John used to swear he built that in, oh, he said I did it in about a week. I can't believe that, but he might have. He's pretty good. Well, this was, what did he call that loop? Went around the mountain. That was main line. This was that area down there at a mine. I don't know what those tank cars are doing down there. They're down there for the picture. He posed pictures and disregarded a great deal of what really happened on the railroad. This was the tightest curve on the Gorre Daphetid, 26-inch radius. He could get everything he had around there. You'd be surprised how much you could. I've got the minimum radius on my railroad is, on the main line, is 19 and a half, and I regularly get a mic around there, no bind, no problem. But I had to go back and plow jockey those rails quite a bit in order to get it around there. But if they're perfectly laid, or very nearly perfectly laid, you can get a lot of equipment around you wouldn't think you could over a small radius curve. But it still looks funny. Does to me. Another picture of the roundhouse area. Not only the roundhouse itself, but he kept accumulating locomotives. Well, this is the locomotive that had the welder on it. I remember that very well. It didn't run, but it sure looked pretty. He put all the outside pipes. All these locomotives would have been, if they were working on them, they had to have steam. If they were working on the brakes, they had to have air, and all those air and steam lines went out to each location around these open air tracks. And there were open air tracks on the other side too. This was an old pay car. It never worked either, because I worked on that railroad many years, and the pay car never paid me or anybody else. There was, at one point back over here, there was a siding, and at a time when, oh, this was again on that narrowest, smallest radius curve on the railroad. Oh no, that's going into Daphetid on the main line. John, at a time when the bulbs were extremely expensive, found one of these little 1.5 volt bulbs. Actually, a friend of his had gotten it for him, and at that time it was so tiny it was used as in the tip of a needle of an aircraft instrument to show you where the tip of that needle was. And he gave it to John, and John was just tickled to death. And so we used a diode to furnish us with the voltage that we wanted. And he made a special figure with a lantern, and he went and made the lantern with the base and all the wire and the little bale that you carry the lantern with, and it was beautifully done, and he was proud of it and justifiably proud of it, and promptly put it on the track somewhere or another. He got one of the leads over on the track and put 5 volts into a 1.5 volt bulb, the only one we knew of that existed right then, at a price we could afford anyway. Burnt the bulb out, but the man stood there and waved his unlighted lantern for the rest of the life of the railroad. That's it. Okay, turn the lights on, John. If any of y'all have any questions or anything that I can give you information or anything else on, don't hesitate. I'm happy as the devil to answer questions.
You built a number of his structures, did you not? How many of his structures did you build?
I don't know. At one time, when I first started building structures for John, I had all of us lay out sort of goals for ourselves, and I wanted one of my structures in every major area on the railroad. And John didn't care where they went. If he wanted a structure, if there was already two of mine there, it didn't make any difference to him. He wanted one of those now. And finally, after I guess about 15 years, I finally had a structure in each of the major areas. Actually, the vast majority of the railroad, John did the work himself. He was so good and so fast, and he was so disappointed with mine and other people's work. He really didn't rely on it any more than he absolutely had to. With a railroad that size, and with the time he had invested in it, I've seen him go to great lengths to create an effect that one person in 1,000 would notice it. You wouldn't notice it, I wouldn't notice it, but he knew it was there, and he would go to that much trouble. He liked to spend his time, he said, I'm a planner, not a doer. He was a doer too, believe me, he really was. He could lay track faster than anybody I've ever seen. My God, he could put down hand-laid track with individual ties, individual rails, and spikes with individual spikes faster than I can put down Atlas track and put nails through it. Boy, he was good with that. He did it with a mirror all the time. He liked to say that he didn't know much about electricity. He was really knowledgeable about it. At one time, before we had momentum throttles and so forth, he built a momentum throttle, and the way he did it was he had 110 volts, and he had a variac that would change the speed of a motor. That motor then generated 12 volts DC, and he used that DC to run his train, and he had perfect control of it. When he said momentum throttle, he wasn't kidding. If you backed your throttle all the way off, that train would go another 20 feet if you didn't put brakes on it some way or another. Because the flywheel just kept generating less and less. Took a long time to stop with that train. The length of the train didn't make a great deal of difference, but boy, it was hard. And he would tell you, he loved to do this to visitors acquaintances of his he'd met at conventions one place or another. They'd come see the railroad. And he let them take the throttle, that momentum throttle, and he said, let me see you stop that engine so that the tender is under the water spout, because we want to put water in it there. And boy, it was hard to do because you'd get a little too far, so you'd reverse it and come up real slow. And when it broke loose, it might move another 3 or 4 inches, much further away than you were when you started. But he had a brake on there. There was a button on there that you could push, and it would put resistance into the line and allow you to slow the engine faster than it ordinarily would come to a stop with the momentum throttle, full momentum throttle. Well, past my bedtime. I appreciate your listening to this foolishness. As I said, if there are any questions.